how I took down a toxic manager who tried to destroy my career. Names and places have been changed to protect the innocent and the not-so-innocent. Some years ago, I started working for a heavy industrial manufacturing company. I lucked out and got a great supervisor for a boss, Joe. The work was hard, working 12-hour days for 13 days in a row and then a Sunday off, then back for another 13 days. I was young and didn't mind. It helped my wife and I save up for a house. After about 6 months, Joe noticed I was picking up on the work pretty fast and promoted me to a group leader position. This came with a raise and increased responsibility that most other workers didn't want. Joe would put me in troubled groups in his department and I would work on general improvements and figuring out the issues. This was a union shop and the mentality was to just put in your hours. Don't work harder or smarter, just do your time and don't kill the job, was the unspoken motto. After a few years, Joe was promoted a manager and he transferred me with him to his departments. While I wasn't a supervisor yet, I was the supervisor in all but name. The supervisors loved it because they never had to leave the office, and I liked it because it was a good learning experience. I made a good reputation and got a lot of respect from workers and from management. Eventually, Joe's areas were doing so well, he was promoted to plant manager. As before, he wanted to promote me with him, this time to a supervisor spot. We talked in length because the only supervisor spot open was working for Karen. Karen was female, a minority, and a member of the LGBTQ community. She was the poster child on the company website of the inclusiveness in the workplace. Literally, her face was the one they used. She was also a freshly minted manager, and Joe was not confident in her abilities, but me being the plucky go-getter with a can-do attitude decided to take the position. I had to interview with Karen and got to meet some of her supervisors. They were very quiet and reserved. Once I was promoted, I worked in tandem with another supervisor, Chris. Chris was young, had one small child and his wife was pregnant and a stay-at-home mom. During the first week everything was going well. I was learning all the employees, getting to know the process, and getting my feeling for the area. During the second week, Chris's wife went into labor and she had a hard time. Chris went on paternity leave for 6 weeks and I was tossed into the deep end in charge of the whole area solo, with 60 employees. I was barely treading water, but I was doing my best. When I would ask Karen for guidance or assistance, she would scoff like it was beneath her and tell me, if I have to do your job then I don't need you. So, I gritted my teeth and worked my tail off. My wife got me a smart watch and I was averaging 25,000 steps a day trying to keep everything running. We were holding our own and employees all did what they could to help as the situation was not ideal for everyone. A few weeks in I was reviewing some quality documents, and I noticed that one of the quality gates was not being followed. I emailed the info to the quality engineers, and they lost their minds. This was a 4-hour operation on a 20-hour part that we were skipping entirely. Turns out one of the reasons Karen got promoted was because she was running her department so efficiently. Then it came to light that she made the decision to skip this quality process, saving that 20% of time. Except the engineers never signed off on this, and it caused massive damage control. The process had to be reinstated and the parts that were never checked had to have warranty extensions. This caused the company to have egg on their face and Karen to look bad. During this time Karen also became more vindictive. She would openly tell people she would never be fired and could do what she wanted. She would walk the departments, and if she didn't like someone, she would make the supervisors write them up by the end of the day. She wanted us to find a reason, and if we didn't, she would take it out on the supervisors. For example, forcing the supervisors to stay late to do inventory or something else menial, just because she could. She would not let the supervisors make any decisions until she approved, so something like overtime had to wait for her approval, and she would not respond until the end of the day, causing the deps to scramble. Then if there weren't enough overtime employees to do the work, she would blame it on the supervisors. While the supervisors knew this wasn't right, we all needed our job and tried to do the best we could for Karen and the employees. We were mainly rodeo clowns to Karen being the bull. The first day Chris was back, him and I were both pulled into Karen's office. She started berating me on how poor of a job I was doing, making her look bad, and how I never came to her for help. This made me speechless because of the previous comments she made and the fact that supervisor work was beneath her. After the meeting, I was still a bit stunned, but I put it together that she was about to railroad me out of the company, and this was the first step. I called Joe and asked for a meeting that same day. When I got together with Joe, I started telling him about the things that were going on that he had no idea: the harassment, the abuse, the vindictive nature. Ironically, while I was speaking with him, another supervisor called him to complain about Karen as well with the same grievances. Joe was stunned and said he would speak with Karen, but he gave me carte blanche on any open spot in the company starting next day. He really didn't want to lose me. I did a lateral transfer to a different department doing engineering/IT work, and I thought that was the end of it. A few weeks later, I was leaving work and Karen mentioned that I never turned in my laptop and phone to her. I told her I didn't know I had to, but that I could give it to her tomorrow. She smirked and said she would get it back soon enough. I didn't think too much of it at the time. After about 6 months, I had my review with my new boss Jake. The review went great. He was very happy with my work, and was a bit surprised at how fast I picked up things. At the end of the meeting, Jake mentioned offhand how Karen tried to intervene in the review and get me fired, but Joe stepped in and squashed it. "Okay, Karen, now you pissed me off." After I left Karen's department, the turnover rate went through the roof. The supervisors were quitting at a rate of 1 every 3 months. Keep in mind that this is a legacy company that had multi-generations working: fathers, mothers, sons, entire families. Some areas had 3 generations working side by side, and yet Karen was rolling over employees and supervisors like a steamroller. Working for her became the kiss of death. I casually mentioned to Joe about the turnover and he told me he couldn't figure out what was going on. People were quitting without notice and no one was doing exit interviews. I told Joe that Karen was writing people up to force them out. When they would hand her the resignation letter or 2 weeks' notice, she would tell them to leave immediately and throw away the letter. Then she would tell HR that the person quit on the spot, and that was the end of it. Joe told me that because of who she was and how high she was, the company wouldn't do anything to her until they had an airtight case, so went to work. I took the supervisors working for Karen out drinking after work a few times a week and made sure I had my hand on the pulse. If someone was quitting, I made sure they emailed their letter of resignation to Karen and CC'd Joe and HR, stayed for their exit interview, and that they called the company integrity hotline for good measure. Things were progressing well, and I had all the supervisors on board except Chris. Chris really needed the job and Karen was not writing him up. Through a stroke of luck, I found out Karen was low-balling his raises as a cost-saving measure. That's why she was not harassing him. When I told Chris, he was furious and wanted to quit on the spot. I encouraged him to speak with Joe before he leaves. Joe and Chris had a very productive meeting and Chris decided to stay. Now all the supervisors were on board. Joe brought in an HR bigwig from the headquarters in Kansas, and over the course of a week each supervisor was sent in for an interview discreetly without Karen knowing. By the time the interviews were over, they had emails, texts, eyewitnesses, and a mountain of evidence. This next part one heard from other people: HR, Joe, etc. Despite everything, the company wanted to keep this quiet, so they brought in Karen and said they no longer needed her and offered a very generous severance package. Karen, being Karen, lost it on the HR people. She threatened to sue for discrimination and even called a lawyer. That's when the company pulled out the stack of evidence and rescinded the severance offer. After a few months, Karen found a new job as a plant manager in a different factory and I found out where. I casually mentioned to the union reps at my factory where Karen was working and suggested that maybe they should give the union at the other factory a call. She was fired within 3 months for employee harassment. Last I heard, she had to sell her house and move out of state to find a job.